Welcome to the plenary session 7, which is predictive coding and consciousness. Jay Sanguinetti and I organized this session. I'm Mary Peterson. Predictive coding, as you probably know, was introduced in 1999 in a paper by Rao and Ballard. They are computer scientists who presented an existence proof that the responses of neurons early in the visual cortex could be produced by learning and by feed-forward and feedback mechanisms. Their work fit within a tradition that dates back to Helmholtz, and roughly contemporaneously, there was some beautiful work by Mumford and Lee that adopted a more neurophysiological approach and incorporated a Bayesian approach to perception. The predictive coding framework has caught on over the last 20 plus years, and it has been extended beyond the visual cortex. But many questions remain. And let me just say that a lot of the extension beyond the visual cortex is due to Carl Friston and Andy Clark. A lot of the really nice empirical work has been done by people who are in this symposium today. Many of the questions that remain now are, how far beyond the visual cortex does the predictive coding framework extend? And what exactly are the mechanisms in the brain that accomplish predictive coding? And finally, what is the relationship between predictive coding and consciousness? The speakers in the session today are going to address those questions. I'll just tell you briefly about each of them because I won't be introducing them in much detail between their talks. Mark Miller is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Sussex. He will be giving the first talk in this symposium. He's working on a project with Andy Clark that aims to deliver an account of conscious experience from the context of embodied agents who can predict many of their own states. That is, agents who can expect themselves. The second speaker is Peter Koch. He is a principal research fellow at the Wellcome Center for Human Neuroimaging at UCL. His work going back to 2012 demonstrates that expectations play a fundamental role in how we perceive the world. Recently, he has been using ultra-high field fMRI to reveal the fine details of the neural circuitry underlying the effects of expectation on sensory processing. And he's expanding his work into neural networks involved in perception and examining the role of the hippocampus in generating top-down expectations in visual cortex. The last speaker in the symposium is Lucia Melloni, who is a group leader at the Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics in Munich. Lucia has long been interested in the role of past experience in perception and the neural mechanisms by which the brain predictively controls sensory processing and perception. Building on the observation that predictions can sometimes stabilize perception and sometimes destabilize it, she asks which role top-down predictions have in consciousness. Today, she will discuss research using neuroimaging, computational modeling, and invasive electrophysiology to investigate the neural mechanism through which predictions interface with consciousness. So with that introduction aside, I would like to ask Mark Miller to begin sharing his screen and to begin his talk. Go ahead, Mark. Mark, someone has to unmute you. I don't seem to have the ability to do that. Chris, can you unmute Mark?
There, how's that? Can you hear me now?
Yes, now
Great,
I can.
okay. And you only have my slide up, is that right?
Yes.
Excellent, great. Okay, hey everybody, good morning. Happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I think between the three of us today, we're gonna be able to cover quite a lot of ground. I suspect that the next two talks are gonna be much more technical than my talk. The talk that I would like to present today is more of a story, but I think it's a very interesting story. So let's see. So the talk that I'm going to be presenting today, which was based on a paper that's coming out in the next couple of weeks in Frontiers of Psychology, is entitled Losing Ourselves, Active Inference, Depersonalization, and Enlightenment. This work, I would like to just start by saying, was done with George Dean at the University of Edinburgh and Sam Wilkinson. They're the chaps up at the top right at the University of Exeter. And I also want to tip my hat to Maxwell Ramstead and Lara Sangved-Smith for supporting this project, but also for a lot of future work that we're working on now in this same avenue, which I'll touch on my very last slide. So the paper really is about exploring how this computational framework, in particular predictive processing and active inference, might be applied to better understand disturbances in selfhood. Both the sort of challenging disturbances that we see in dissociative disorders like depersonalization, but also in those disruptions in self that meditators seek, right? At the very heart of the sort of Buddhist meditative paradigm is a really going after a sort of selfless experience. So our original interest in doing this sort of research was really because there is a popular movement today where lots of people are starting to talk about some of the similarities, some of the proposed similarities between dissociative disorders like depersonalization and the sort of selfless experiences that we see in meditative traditions. So for instance, Shinzen Young, right, the meditation teacher and neuroscience aficionado, he's recently called depersonalization the evil twin of Buddhist enlightenment. And that family resemblance has really caught fire. And people are, you know, on a spectrum really interested in how do these things relate, all the way from some people saying they're identical, that actually enlightenment just is a sort of dissociative disorder, all the way to the opposite end, which I'm much closer to, which is they are very, very different. So the idea was to look at these two states, these two styles of self-experience through the lens of predictive processing and active inference to see what we can learn computationally. So I'm going to start just by saying it's easy to see why these things are sometimes conflated or why we think that there might be a family resemblance. So here's a definition of depersonalization. So depersonalization is a detachment within the self regarding one's mind or body, or being a detached observer of oneself. Subjects feel like they have changed and that the world has become vague, dreamlike, less real, lacking in significance, and it can be a very disturbing experience. So just contrasting that with three comments that come from the Buddhist meditative tradition now. The first is the cessation of suffering, so this is really the primary aim of the Buddhist soteriological project, is attained by extirpating all sense of an I that serves as agent or owner. 2, identifying the body or the mind as the self is dismissed as a mistaken view by the Buddha. Yeah, and the Anatta-Lakkhana Sutta clearly states that none of the aggregates, that's bodily form, valence, perception, volitional activities, or consciousness, should be regarded as a self. And finally, like the dream you had last night, this day that you are having right now is a mere appearance in your own mind. So I hope you can see that even from this small subset, there really is a shared language. There's a sort of shared vocabulary of first personal experiences with people who are having a dissociative disorder and people who are in these sorts of meditative traditions. But looked at through the lens of predictive processing or active inference, they turn out to be computationally and in fact biologically almost opposites. So that's what I'd like to bring out today. Just before I get into it, I just want to prime you with two things. One, this paper turned out to be a real beast. It's the longest paper I've ever written. I'm surprised they let me publish it at the length it is. So with only 25 minutes to give you guys a look at it, I've had to really narrow my scope. So I picked one puzzle out of the paper, and that's the one I'm going to present. But thankfully, I think it's the coolest puzzle, and I think it's the puzzle that the most people are going to be interested in, not only researchers, but I hope practitioners who are here with us today. I hope you can both take something from this, or at least I hope it whets your appetite for this research paradigm. And last but not least, I want to apologize because there's going to be a few places where you're going to catch on. I'm going to have to jump over some computationally tricky bits. We just don't have time to get into it today, but I'll flag those bits and I'll tell you specific papers that you can go mine if you want to see the computational bit. And if that's not satisfying, the paper will be out in the next couple of weeks, and you can see in all of its splendor there. Okay, so let's start with what's actually happening in depersonalization. Well, there's an increasingly popular view that depersonalization acts like a kind of airbag. in traumatic situations, right? So when fight or flight is unable to get you out of an overwhelmingly and emotionally painful experience, then disassociation occurs as part of what alleviates that suffering. And a part of that disassociation, it's increasingly seen, is that the affective system, the system that's actually responsible for creating the suffering, it gets its volume turned way down. So that comes with this disassociation. This is what Medford has called desomaticization or deaffectation. Okay, and we see this neurobiologically in the insular cortex, which with people who are suffering depersonalization, the insular parts of the insular cortex, they reduce its processing and reduce its output. So it really does become muted. And we know that the insular cortex is widely associated with processing affective salience. Just as a side note here, we can actually see when depersonalization is getting better by the reawakening of insular activity. So when you start seeing the insular start acting like it normally does, that's usually a marker that the depersonalization experiences are coming to an end. And it's pretty interesting to note that mindfulness training has been shown sort of systematically and across the board as one kind of practice that we can be doing that really beefs up the insular cortex. So connectivity and size of the insular cortex changes, probably because we're meditating on our bodies in lots of traditions where you're really growing your interoceptive access. So there already is a big difference between these two species, right? One is the affective processes start going silent, and the other is actually you're beefing those up. We'll come back to that in a little bit. So various researchers who are catching on to this important role that affectivity plays in depersonalization have started to suggest that it is that affective dampening that's responsible for the strange phenomenology in DPD, depersonalization. So that sense of feeling like you've lost something important about yourself, or that the world has lost something important in it, that's going to be closely related with this affective dampening, but it's still not very well understood why. Why is it that when we lose affect, do we lose these other bits of the self? And that's what we wanted to go after in a part of our paper, is to try to really understand that connection. So I'm sure many of you have already, you're already familiar with predictive processing and active inference. I get you to raise your hand, but I can't see you today. So I'm gonna guess that maybe some of you aren't. So I'll just very quickly give you the core bits so you can follow along. Here's the basic thing you need to know. One, this framework says that the brain is a kind of prediction engine, okay? So the brain is continually aiming to come up with the best hypothesis or model about what's going on in the world. And that model generates predictions moment to moment. And when those predictions are inaccurate, so when the prediction doesn't match what's actually happening in the world, then it generates prediction errors. And those errors, they flow forward in the system and help update predictions and help update the model so that we can get a better predictive grip. And according to the story, that's what the brain does. And for some, that's what the whole organism does. That's just what life is. Life is all this trying to get the best possible model in order to get the best predictive grip in the world. In a series of papers, my colleagues and I have been developing a new view of affectivity within this framework. So very briefly, from our perspective, valence, so that's the positive and negative feelings, they emerge as a reflection of how well or poorly we're doing at managing these errors, how well or poorly we're doing at predicting. So when error is reduced faster or slower than expected, that is when we're getting a better predictive grip on the scene or increasingly losing our predictive grip on the scene, that's actually felt. Those changes in error reduction are felt. Those are the feelings of good feelings and bad feelings. Feelings of hopefulness and joy and feelings of frustration and disappointment are actually tracking how well we are doing at reducing error. And if you want to see this computationally, definitely check out Hesp et al.'s paper, Deeply Felt Affect, that just came out. It's a great computational paper for just that point. Right, so, oh, as a note, for those of you who are familiar with the framework, you should see that there's a little change here, right? It's not that feelings just emerge from top-down predictions about the body. That's what we originally thought in the literature, but rather, these feelings are arising based on how well we're predicting. So they're not the outcome of prediction, but rather they're second order. They're tracking how well we're doing at predicting. So just to reiterate, bodily feelings then provide predictive organisms like us this constant ongoing feedback. about the reliability of our predictions, the reliability of our model. And insofar as they do that, they end up playing a central role in adjusting precision. Precision is one more mechanism that's really central to this framework. It's the element of the process that varies the extent to which specific prediction errors will be taken seriously by the system or have real causal efficacy within the system. Okay, so for example, if you're walking home and it's very, very foggy, you'll downregulate the amount of emphasis that your visual information is giving you because it's foggy. Rather, you might rely more on memory rather than on your vision. So another way of saying that is that feelings here tune the predictive system. And it's always tuning the predictive system towards opportunities to improve its grip and away from less predictable scenes. And the result of this then is that we're always being pushed and pulled by the world affectively as a means of as optimizing our grip with those things that we care about, our cares and our concerns. And we suggest in the paper that this affective tuning is a potential computational correlate for our feeling of being a self. What it means to feel like being a self is this constant push and pull relative to your cares and concerns, this push and pull relative to your predictive grip. Okay. Not only does this give us a little bit of, given that, then you can imagine what happens when this goes missing in DPD, right? So if that's the case, then if affect goes missing, so too does this tuning mechanism, this precision estimator goes missing also. So the result would be really a simultaneous loss of our sort of internal sense of being moved towards what matters and a loss of the soliciting force of the environmental affordances. So really the world would start showing up much more flat, really uninviting. We wouldn't feel like we were drawn towards anything anymore. And that's exactly the kind of phenomenology that we see in DPD. So we think it's a good approach. Not only does this account give us a possible clue about some of the phenomenology, it also tells us a little bit about how it might happen. So think about when you're struggling to learn a new instrument, like the violin. If the song is too hard, you start to get frustrated, right? So things are going worse than expected. Errors are on the rise. That signals to the system that you're failing to get good predictive control. So what ordinarily happens? Well, the negative affect here, according to our story, reduces our confidence. It takes precision off of the action, that is learning this particular too hard song at the violin. And the result would be a sort of natural task switching, right? So we would look for an easier song. We might go back to earlier chords, or we might move on to something else where we've got a better predictive grip. That's what happens in a normal system. Error goes on the rise, the negative affectivity takes the precision off of that activity, and so there's a natural switching to somewhere else where you might be able to get a better predictive grip. Because the system is hierarchically stacked, the fact is you can lose confidence at one level, like not being able to play that song well, and that doesn't mean you're going to lose confidence at the higher level. So local errors can be perfectly accommodated by more global predictions. So just because you fail at learning a hard song doesn't mean you think you're going to lose confidence in yourself as a human being making your way in the world. That's just one layer of the system starts losing confidence. But what happens if the unexpected rise in error keeps going regardless of what you do? What if perceptual updates and behavioral interventions didn't do anything about the rising volatility? What if the environment was so volatile that there was no way that you could task switch in order to get out of that volatility? And that's exactly what we see in cases like chronic pain or severe trauma, both of which are candidates for creating depersonalization symptoms, right? So here's what we think will happen. So in active inference terms, trauma can be understood as a massive influx of error, right? So the body's integrity, that's highly expected, phenotypically highly expected. So when we have a trauma, when the body's seriously disrupted or damaged, then error suddenly goes on the rise. And there might be nothing you can do about it, nowhere you can go where that pain will be cessated. The result would be that you would lose confidence not only at the lower level, but at the more domain general level as well. As soon as you learn that task switching won't get you out of the way of this volatility, then the system starts thinking that even that higher level is no longer reliable. It's no longer a reliable way to get to the place that you want to go. So computationally, that ends up meaning that we lose confidence at the next level And if that one doesn't work, the next level, the next level, the next level. And you can have a sort of perfect storm here where error just keeps cascading up, reducing your confidence all the way through the system until basically you end up not thinking that you have confidence to ever get to where you want to be able to go, right? So the end result is we have no confidence that we're able to bring about the results that we predict. So the consequence of that, and we can show this computationally, for this you'll have to see the paper, but what ends up happening is the system, then all it can do is it can unravel the system that's basically generating these affective states. So technically that would mean that our inferred confidence in our expected free energy, which is G in the model, it starts losing precision all the way around. And with it, we suspect, so goes the sense of self. So the dampening of affect and that real feeling of self and the loss of that feeling are really intimately related here. So in losing a sense of predictive control, the affective system, it just stops tuning us to opportunities to improve. So nothing now is motivationally salient because the system infers that nothing it does will have any effect on the outcome, right? So that's our view of DPD computationally to start with. Now, what we thought was interesting about that and its relationship to meditation is that meditation also looks at changes, in particular, how we experience valence as markers along the Buddhist sartoriological path. We see similar markers along that path in the meditative tradition, changes in how we experience valence. So let me just go over that briefly. So in our paper, we looked mostly at what's called focused attention meditation. As you know, meditation is it's an umbrella concept. So there's lots of kinds of meditation. We really followed Antoine Lutz and colleagues' paper in 2019 here, which is a fantastic paper. Definitely check it out. It's also on predictive processing and meditation. Very quickly, focused attention meditation proceeds like this. You choose to attend to an object. When the mind wanders, you notice the shift. You notice what the shift is about. You actively let go of the distractor. You reorient attention back to the target. That's sort of it. And while that process can look like it's all about refining attention, and that's true, actually the real benefit that it provides practitioners is that that style of watching the mind creates an almost optimal opportunity to learn about the function and the nature of mental processing, right? So meditation provides us a sort of space to watch how our various processes, those that make up our mind-body experience, what they do, how they turn on, how they persist, how they interact with one another, how they eventually dissolve. We thought that the language of transparency and opacity could be useful here, if you're not familiar with it. To say that a mental process is transparent is to say that its contents are available to consciousness, but its actual construction process isn't. So another way of saying that is to render one of these processes opaque is to gain access to its earlier stages of processing. So how does it begin? How does it persist? How does it dissolve? And that's really the aim of meditation. The aim of meditation here is to render opaque these various physiological and psychological processes. And a really interesting thing happens when you start to render these processes opaque. This is a quote from Thomas Metzinger on just this point. So it's a great quote, so I thought maybe we could just read it. So Metzinger writes, transparent phenomenal states make their representational content appear irrevocably real as something the experience of which cannot be put into doubt. Okay, so put more precisely, you may certainly be able cognitively to have doubt about its existence, but according to the subjective experience, this phenomenal content, for instance, the awfulness of pain or the fact that it's your pain, is not something you can distance yourself from. The phenomenology of transparency is the phenomenology of direct realism, and is the domain, and in the domain of self-representation, it creates the phenomenology of identification. So if you're not privy to these early constructive stages of these processes, then these things really feel real and they really feel like they're yours. So the result of modeling these processes in just the way that we do in this meditative introspective activity isn't that these processes go away, and that's very important. We'll come back to that in a second, but rather they just lose this quality of immediateness, of irrefutability, and of the sense that they're essential to who and what we are. So I'll give you a quick example that I like. So think about jealousy. So if you experience jealousy transparently, then your experience is of a world that's filled with unfaithful lovers and possibly suspicious others. That's really the world you live in, right? You're not experiencing your jealousy as an object, rather you're seeing the world transparently through your jealousy. But what happens when we really introspect and we start to see that jealousy is really just a sort of bodily response due to conditioned stimuli? Then what do we see? Well, we see that it can be mistaken, right? That maybe jealousy doesn't track reality every time. And sometimes we see that it's not even us, right? We see that jealousy is actually just a habit, and we don't even know where the habit started. It was just sort of formed at some point in time, and it's being triggered now. And that's why I try to have meditators as friends, right? Because to have people in your life who really know that, that's a great thing, you know, to have that sort of self-understanding. Okay, bear with me. I'm going to come back to affect here in a second. So the Satipatthana Sutta, this is one of the foremost meditation manuals in the Buddhist tradition. It directs meditators to closely examine, to render opaque, in just the way that we've been discussing, the various processes that make up our experience. Those are bodily form, valence, right? Perception, volitional activities, and consciousness. And as each of those are modeled, and so rendered opaque, they begin to lose the sense of realness, of personalness, and it's that gradual process that the Buddhist practitioners are using to really reveal that there's no such thing as an independent, self-existing self. They model the whole thing. If you model all these processes that ordinarily make up our experience of being a self, and they start losing their personableness, then you ipso facto realize, well, maybe there's no self, right? These things that make up the self, well, they're not really self-like things. So rendering valence here opaque is the keynote. This is a real keystone for my talk here. It turns out to be really important in the Buddhist meditative trajectory. And there's a really large story here, we can't get into it today, about the role that valence plays in particular in engendering craving and suffering and really becoming the fuel that keeps this mistaken view of self up and functioning, that mistaken view that Buddhists are trying to overcome. We don't have time to get into that today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to limit it instead, because I think this is enough. It's enough to highlight that rendering valence systems opaque is, in active inference or predictive processing terms, to model this essential precision tuning mechanism opaque. That's really what's happening, is you're beginning to model your own precision machinery that's usually working in the background of your predictive model. And when that happens, well, computationally, all sorts of really interesting things happen, and they turn out to look very similar to the things that Buddhist practitioners would suspect were going to happen. So first, one begins to act with less preference relative to those signals. So the valence signal, you know, our pleasure and our pain, they remain. In fact, valence is considered neutral in the Buddhist tradition relative to well-being in Buddhism, okay? So valence remains, it's neutral, but by rendering the process opaque, it loses some of its strong motivational force. And we show this computationally in the paper, so check that out. Essentially what it means is we stop being a slave to that tuning mechanism. Not that the tuning mechanism goes away, but it gets recontextualized. It's important to note here that because valence doesn't go away, it's very different from what's happening in DPD. So meditation in this context, it doesn't aim to disrupt valence. That's really important. And we went right back to the suttas, and it's in the paper, but you're not supposed to disrupt valence permanently, not in the way that it's disrupted in DPD. The aim is rather to better understand that process, to be able to model it more fully, and to be able to reap the benefits of modeling it. And also, I might note—
5 minutes left, Mark.
Oh, great. Okay. Then let's just go to the next slide. So this is the more important thing, and I don't have time to talk about it today. Second, by modeling this precision machinery, a whole new layer of optimization opens up. Now, this is really exciting stuff, and it's a bit technical. I really suggest you go see Lars Sangdev-Smith's new paper, 2020 paper on this, because he makes this part computationally super clear. In short, by rendering the precision system opaque, the system then becomes able to use to take those precision estimations as observations in the system. And that means that a new higher order prediction is able to be made over top of those precisions. So in other words, instead of valence systems just driving behavior around directly, which happens, that's what happens when valence is seen transparent, is experienced transparently, one begins to learn to actively be able to select what behavioral routines they're engaging in with more freedom. And, you know, valence unbridled really drives us towards our evolutionarily ancient and probably outdated styles of being. Okay, so here's the summary. So what are we thinking so far about DPD and meditation from this perspective? Well, here's what I think. Depersonalization is characterized by a critical loss of control and a loss of affective processing, this quality of affective processing. Meditation in complete opposition is a gradual opacification of the affective system, and the development of one's metacognitive capacities in that process. Actually, it helps us to further contextualize and so control our precision estimations in new and powerful ways. So in terms of predictive control, these are opposites. Computationally speaking, they are opposites rather than sharing one family resemblance. And if I have just a few more minutes, I just want to say something quick. I think this is good for all the practitioners here. Although we found that the family resemblance between the two stops after just talking, computationally, they're very, very different. There's a big story to be told still about how DPD can be benefited by meditation, but also how meditation can lead to DPD. So just very, very quickly, Willoughby Britton in the Dark Knight Project has documented all sorts of cases where meditation has caused challenges. Lots of those occur because of our persistently looking towards difficult stimuli in our meditation, right? So constantly looking towards painful or traumatic stimulation in our meditative practice. And that works. It works for people who tend to avoid these hardships, because avoidance, we know, actually perpetuates all sorts of psychological disorder. But for people who obsess, for people who don't avoid, but people who obsess, those sorts of meditative situations where they're being asked to look at something that's incredibly difficult, we have evidence now that shows that that actually can produce and exacerbate dissociative tendencies like we see in depersonalization. And our framework shows that computationally. If depersonalization, this is my last point, if depersonalization really is like an airbag that's deployed when there's an overly traumatic emotional experience, then just imagine that persistently meditating on overwhelming traumatic experiences without being able to get away, just by sitting, that really can produce exactly those conditions. So meditation in that sense would really turn into a sort of psychological self-torture. So it's something to really pay attention to. In this situation, meditation could lead to the same perceived loss of control rather than to the liberating states that the self-understanding is meant to engender. And that's it. If anybody here is interested in this work, we have a great research group being built right now. You can reach out to me here at my email or check out my website, and we'd be excited to meet you.
Thank you, Mark. Very interesting and intriguing. This raises lots of interesting questions and lots of room for discussion. Unfortunately, there is not a lot of time for discussion. There's 1 minute before we have to start the next talk, and I'm not seeing on my feed any questions that would last only 1 minute.
No 1 minute questions, all good. We'll catch up at the end then.
Yeah, so we will have a long 30-minute, I hope, question and answer period at the end. So, oh, here's one question. Let me see. The question is this one: would near-death out-of-body experience be an example of extreme depersonalization? Can you answer that one quickly?
No, I have no idea. I'd have to think. Let me take the time and think about it while everybody else is speaking, and I'll let you know if I come up with anything.
Okay, sounds good to me. The next speaker in this session is Peter Koch. Peter, can you start sharing your screen now? And can somebody unmute Peter?
Is this working? Can you hear me? And
yes.
Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Perfect.
Go ahead.
Okay. Thanks very much. Thanks very much for inviting me for this this excellent symposium. So the research that I do focuses on how our expectations shape the way we perceive the world, visual perception in this case, And I conduct this research at the Wellcome Center for Human Neuroimaging at the University College London. And I just want to start with some very simple examples. So if you have a look at this video, I hope it will work online. You'll see that you're looking at a face carved out of a piece of stone. But as you now face this sculpture head on, you'll probably have an illusion of suddenly this face popping out of the sculpture. So even though you know that actually this face is a hollow face that's been carved into this slab of stone, you really perceive it as a face coming out of the stone because you have so much prior expectation of faces being convex rather than concave. So another example is this one. So these two very blurry shapes probably don't mean much to you at all if you look at them as they are now in isolation. But when I put them in their proper context of this blurry street scene, you'll immediately recognize that what you've been looking at were a car here and a pedestrian. But in fact, if I now take these stimuli, these blurry shapes out of their context again and rotate them in the same orientation, it turns out that they're in fact just two identical blurry shapes that don't have any features in them of themselves that make them a car or a pedestrian. Our perception of them as a car and a pedestrian is really determined by our prior knowledge of what kind of things are likely to be present in street scenes. So these are two very specific examples of how our prior knowledge or expectations can change the way we perceive the world. And in a symposium at the start of this conference about psychedelics, Andrew Will mentioned that even much more striking phenomena can happen as a result of expectation, namely even in placebo groups in psychedelic studies, up to 60% of people can have psychedelic experiences even though they haven't received such a drug. Just the expectation that they would have this kind of drug administered and have these kind of experiences can be sometimes enough to evoke these kind of striking experiences. So expectation plays a large role in the way we perceive the world. Now, unfortunately, in the lab, most of my studies use much more boring stimuli, such as the ones shown here. So in this study, I'll be talking about first a low tone presented to a participant may predict that they're going to see a right-tilted grating, and a high-pitched tone might predict that they're going to see a left-tilted grating. So as I said, much more simple and boring stimuli, but these, of course, we choose for reasons of experimental control so that we can really do very specific experimental manipulations and look at very specific neural signals. So in this particular experiment, the auditory cue was presented first and then followed by a grating. And this first grating stimulus was then followed by a second grating stimulus, which was almost identical to the first, just rotated slightly. And people's task here was to indicate whether the second grating was rotated slightly clockwise or anti-clockwise with respect to the first. This was just to give people a task so that they would pay attention to the stimuli. The crucial manipulation here was that in 75% of the trials, things occurred as outlined here. So the tone would be followed by the grating that was predicted based on the pitch of the tone. But in 25%, the other 25% of trials, we omitted the visual gratings altogether. So in these trials, people heard an auditory cue, a low or a high-pitched tone, that led to a very specific expectation of either a right-tilted or a left-tilted grating, but the screen stayed completely empty, except for this little bullseye in the center where people were meant to fixate. So this task was intended to try to isolate expectation signals and try to see if they influence visual processing. So the area we focus on particularly is V1, the primary visual cortex, which is the first cortical stage where information from the eyes is processed. So this area was traditionally thought to be really driven just by the eyes, by the retina, the optic nerve, etc. But now the question we're asking is, can even this earliest cortical stage of visual information processing be influenced by what we expect? Okay, so we used fMRI for to look at this. This is a zoomed-in MRI scan of the, where you see the back of the brain. The yellow outline indicates where V1 is, and the color of these little dots there indicates the activity evoked by a certain condition. And these little pixels that we're looking at, or voxels, three-dimensional pixels, is where we get our signals from in fMRI. And what we did in this study is we looked at these primary visual cortex voxels and split them up according to which stimuli they responded to, so which stimuli they preferred. So here what you see is that voxels that prefer right-tilted gratings were slightly more active when people expected to see a right-tilted grating than when people expected to see a left-tilted grating, even though, as you'll remember, the screen was completely empty on these trials. And vice versa for voxels that prefer left-tilted gratings. So basically what we see here is that there's a pattern of activity in the primary visual cortex that, that signals, that indicates what kind of stimulus people were expecting to see, even though there was no input to the eyes. So this is quite striking, but there were lots of questions about the neural mechanisms underlying this phenomenon, and I'll dive into that a little bit more in the next few minutes. So one theory that inspires a lot of our thinking about the neural circuits underlying these kinds of phenomena is predictive coding, which has been introduced much more in a much more sophisticated way already by Mark. So I'll just very briefly just highlight what I think is one of the crucial predictions of this theory, which is that within every cortical area, there are two separate populations of neurons. One called prediction units, which indicate our predictions or hypotheses about what's out there in the world, and prediction error units, which signal the mismatch between those hypotheses and the actual inputs we receive. So this is a theory that's very popular and also explains lots of phenomena that have been observed in terms of expectations influencing our perception. So in this kind of architecture, how might we think about the effects that we've just seen? Well, it could be that once an auditory cue is presented, that predicts a particular visual input, so let's say a right-tilted grating, that these prediction units start becoming active. Specifically the prediction units that are tuned for the right-tilted expected grating. And then if that stimulus were indeed to be presented after the auditory cue, then this leads to only a small prediction error response, because this was, after all, an expected stimulus. And the hypothesis or prediction of a right-tilted grating is reinforced, and we have a very clear, signal and very strong inference that indeed a right-tilted grating was presented. Now, what happens if you present an unexpected stimulus? This is slightly more complicated. So perhaps what might happen in this case is you get a large prediction error response because this is not the expected stimulus. Therefore, the hypothesis of a right-tilted grating is abandoned, and now the hypothesis of a left-tilted grating is activated. So as I said, this post-stimulus phase is a lot more complicated. So for now, we'll first focus on this initial phase. Is it really true that the brain pre-activates a hypothesis of what you're going to see next before the actual input arrives in the system? So in this study, we used a similar paradigm as the one I've just discussed, but crucially now, we're using MEG as our technique to study the neural signals. So the problem with fMRI that I've used on in the previous study is that we don't have a good temporal resolution. So we don't have any way of knowing whether these expectation signals that we observed really were predictions in the sense of coming before the visual input, or whether they were more of a surprise signal occurring after the brain has realized that the expected stimulus was omitted. So now in this study, we used MEG, where we can track the neural signals with millisecond resolution. And we use a machine learning technique, which I won't go into any details about, but feel free to ask questions if you're interested, to track which orientation, which grating was represented in the neural signal with a millisecond time resolution. And there, what we observed is that here encircled in green, after the auditory cue, but crucially before the grading was presented, there was already a representation of the expected grading orientation present in the neural signal in the visual cortex. So yes, indeed, just having an expectation is enough to evoke a kind of a template of the expected stimulus in the visual cortex before any visual input is presented. Now, predictive coding makes another very interesting prediction, which is, as I mentioned, predictions and prediction errors are represented in different neurons within each cortical region. But more specifically, prediction units or hypothesis units are thought to be present in the deep layers of the cortex, whereas prediction error units are thought to be present in the superficial layers of the cortex. This is because of the direction of message passing. Predictions are passed down the cortical hierarchy, and we know that feedback originates from the deep layers of cortex, but prediction errors are sent upwards in the visual hierarchy, and feed-forward signals are sent by the superficial layers. Now, the problem with testing this hypothesis in humans is that, so the hypothesis, to make it clear, is that these hypotheses, these expectation signals that we've been seeing, would occur in the prediction units in the deep layers. The problem is that human neocortex is quite thin. It's only about 2.5 millimeters thick in the primary visual cortex, and that's pretty close to the typical voxel or pixel size in fMRI. So with conventional fMRI, we'd never be able to tease apart these different layers of the cortex. But in some recent work we've been doing, we've tried to push the spatial resolution of fMRI to make this possible. So in using 7 Tesla high field fMRI, we've been able to push the spatial resolution of fMRI to 0.8 millimeter voxels. So that means that now, instead of having one voxel that spans the entire cortex, we have about 3 voxels that span the cortical thickness. And in addition, we use some spatial regression analysis techniques to try to separate the signals from the different layers better. So in reality, there are six histological layers making up the cortex, but we separate our signals into 3 layers: deep layers, middle layers, and superficial layers. Again, I'm not going into any details of the analysis here. I just want to give you an overview of the kind of results that we've been getting, but I'm happy to answer any questions about the techniques if there are any. So this study was led by Fraser, a postdoc in my lab, who's recently moved to King's College here in London. And there were 2 master students also involved who helped out a lot, Georges and Oliver. And we used, again, a similar paradigm as before, but the only difference being that now we didn't use auditory cues to predict which grading was going to be presented, but colored dots for pure practical reasons that in this high field scanner, which we scanned on the high field scanner in Oxford, auditory presentation wasn't possible at that time. And again, the crucial trials here were omission trials where people had a strong expectation of a specific grading, but nothing was presented to the eyes. Okay, so now we look at the signal evoked by the different conditions in our experiment, but separately for the 3 different layers of cortex. So here on the x-axis, you see the signal in the deep, the middle, and the superficial layers of cortex. And on the y-axis is the stimulus-specific bold signal. So it's not just the overall amplitude evoked in cortex, but it's the activity that is specific to the grading that was presented or expected. So the left tilted or right tilted grading, similar to the very first study I presented. Here we see the signal evoked by on the trials when a stimulus grading was actually presented. And as you see, all the layers of cortex are activated as we would expect from what we know from neurophysiology. The crucial question is what happens on the omission trials where nothing is presented, there's only an expectation. And now we see, again, as in the first study, we see that there is a very specific bold signal reflecting the expected stimulus in the primary visual cortex, but that's only present in the deep layers of the cortex. It's not present in the middle and the superficial layers. And this actually shows a striking correspondence with a study we did a few years ago, where we studied the Kanizsa illusion. So in this illusion, it looks like there's a white triangle overlaying 3 black circles, which is an illusory triangle. It's not actually there. And we studied the activity evoked by this illusory triangle, again in the primary visual cortex. And there, as we also found that these illusory triangles evoked activity in the primary visual cortex, but only in the deep layers of the cortex and not in the middle and the superficial layers. So there's some interesting correspondence here between these two different top-down signals, these two very different types of expectations or predictions, if you will. So they're very different types of expectations, but in both cases, they evoke very specific activity in the deep layers of the primary visual cortex. Okay, so it seems now that we've learned a lot more about these expectation signals, that they can occur prior to any stimulus being presented to the eyes, and they are specific to the deep layers of the cortex. Now, what about this post-stimulus phase where things get a lot more complicated? This is something we've tried to address in a recent study, again led by Fraser, with help by a brilliant master's student, Georgia Turner. And again, we used MEG to try to look at this in a time-resolved manner. In this task, similar type of manipulation, but slightly different stimuli. An auditory cue was followed by a noisy moving dot cloud, and people indicated by orienting a line segment what the direction of motion was of these moving dots. There were two different auditory cues. One predicted more vertical motion and one predicted more horizontal motion. The first thing we wanted to look at, does this auditory cue influence what people perceive? And yes, it did. So here on the x-axis of this graph, you see the actual direction of the moving dots, and on the y-axis, the perceived direction of the moving dots. The only difference between the red and the blue line here is which auditory cue was presented. And you can see that on average, when the auditory cue predicting more vertical motion, 63 degrees, was presented, people reported seeing more vertical motion. And in a previous study that we did, we looked at this with fMRI, and we found that also in the visual cortex, the representations are biased by the auditory cues. So now we're looking at the same kind of representation, but now we're not looking at people's reports, but at the motion direction represented in their visual cortex as determined with fMRI. But what we wanted to do in the current study, crucially, is look at this in a time-resolved manner to see, is it really true that really early processing of these stimuli is biased by these predictive cues? So here we plot the representation of motion direction in the visual cortex as determined with MEG over time. And as you can see, the only difference again between the red and the blue traces is which auditory cue, so which predictive cue was presented. And you can see that the lines start to diverge at around 150 milliseconds post-stimulus, such that when the cue predicting more vertical motion is presented, more vertical motion is represented in the visual cortex, and vice versa for the other cue. So if we subtract these two lines, this difference score indicates where there are differences in the neural signals due to the auditory cue. And we wanted to try to link this to the perceptual effect we saw. It could be that they're just two parallel signals that don't actually have anything to do with each other, or it could be that this is part of the neural correlate of this bias in perception that we see. So the first thing we did very simply is to look at this separately for participants who showed a bias in their behavior by the auditory cue. And we found that in those participants, indeed, this neural bias was reliably present and actually showed up at a slightly later time point, around 300 milliseconds as well. Whereas for participants whose behavior, whose perception was not biased by the auditory cues, we didn't find any neural bias either. So it seems that indeed there is a relationship between these neural and these perceptual biases. And we looked into this a little bit more in one additional analysis, where now on every trial, we looked at, does the neural signal correlate with the motion direction people reported seeing? more than it correlated with the motion direction that was presented on the screen. And we found that indeed that was the case for people who were biased by the cues. So this indicates that the neural representations of these motion dot clouds correlated more with what people thought they saw, reported seeing, than what was presented to their eyes. And this, strikingly, this correlation was present post-stimulus, so around 200 milliseconds, a bit earlier than that, but also already prior to stimulus presentation. So here at time 0, that's when the moving dot cloud appears on the screen. Already around 200 milliseconds before that, there is a correlation between neural signals and perceptual reports, meaning that the pre-stimulus state of cortex, probably evoked by these expectation cues, can predict what people will see later. And this, again, was not present at all for people whose behavior was not biased by these auditory cues. So all in all, this later stimulus phase where expectations and sensory input start to interact is a lot more complicated. And there's a lot of questions we don't have the answers to yet, but we are starting to see that there are some important interactions going on in early visual cortex that are correlated to people's perceptual reports. Okay, so I want to switch to a slightly different question for the last part of my talk, which is where might these expectation signals come from? So on the right here, you see a typical diagram of the visual cortical hierarchy. But in a lot of these expectations, it's that both in the ones that I've showed you with our lab manipulations, but also in the real world, these expectations often originate from cross-modal associations. So here I've been talking about the tones predicting gratings, but you could also think of more real-life examples like the bark of your dog leading to a very specific visual prediction about what you're going to see next. So visual cortex doesn't have access to those auditory stimuli, of course. So how does this come about? So when thinking about the source of these signals, we reasoned that it would have to be a region that receives input from multiple sensory modalities, also be able to send feedback back to those sensory modalities to send the predictions, and be able to learn statistical regularities between inputs very quickly, because these tone grating pairs that I've been talking about, they're picked up by people very quickly in just a matter of a few minutes. So we hypothesized that the hippocampus may play an important role in generating these kinds of expectation signals. And to look into this, sorry, and just one more point on this, hippocampus is usually, of course, thought of in the context of memory, but some of those mechanisms that it uses in the service of memory are also perfectly suited for playing a role in expectations. And the main one I'm thinking about for today's talk is pattern completion, being able to reinstate a complete pattern or event from a partial cue. So in this case, it might be that once the auditory cue is presented, the hippocampus is able to retrieve the full set of associations, namely the auditory cue plus the associated grating, and then send this representation of this grating to the visual cortex as a prediction. So to test this, we use slightly different visual stimuli, these complex shapes that are 5 discrete samples along a continuous shape dimension that we generated. Auditory cues predict which shape will be presented. Rising tones, for instance, predict this shape will be presented, or falling tones predict this other shape will be presented. And on 25% of the trials, the unexpected shape is presented. So we use a similar type of trial setup as before. So first an auditory cue, then either the predicted or an unpredicted shape, and then a second shape that was either identical or slightly warped. And people's task was simply to say, were the two shapes the same or different, just to keep their attention focused on these shapes. And what we found is that in the hippocampus, we saw representations of these shapes. So we used a machine learning algorithm, as in previous studies, slightly different machine learning algorithm this time, to try to retrieve from the pattern of activity in the hippocampus, which shape was represented.
Peter, 5 minutes left.
Perfect. Thanks, Mary. So on trials where the predictions were valid, so let's say the second shape out of the 5 was both cued, so predicted, as well as presented, we found that the pattern of activity in the hippocampus reflected that predicted and presented shape. The crucial question was, what happens when these two diverge? So what happens when one shape, so the 4th shape here, is predicted by the auditory cue, but another shape, shape number 2, is presented? In that case, the activity pattern in the hippocampus was completely dominated by the predicted shape and not by the one that was presented on the screen. So hippocampus activity patterns were completely dominated by these predictive associations, regardless what was presented on screen. And this is very different from what happens in the visual cortex, where things are dominated by what the input to our eyes, with still a modulation by our expectations. That's what I've been talking about before. But all in all, these high contrast visual stimuli will dominate the response. So we see these representations of the predictions in the hippocampus. Is that relevant at all for what happens in sensory processing in the visual cortex? So to look at that, we first looked at what happens in visual cortex when you have a prediction. Well, we see that early on, especially in the fMRI signal, there's an advantage to having a valid cue. And it turns out that across participants, the stronger the prediction signal is in the hippocampus, the stronger the advantage the predicted stimulus has in the visual cortex, in the lateral occipital cortex to be specific. So that does suggest that there is some relationship between these hippocampal predictions and processing in the visual cortex. Okay, I'll just skip this study. There's another study by Fraser looking at hippocampus showing that during learning, these prediction effects emerge simultaneously in the hippocampus, in the top trace, and in the visual cortex, again suggesting there's a link. And I'll just wrap up by saying that expectations generate stimulus templates in deep layers of the visual cortex. These templates can bias the way we perceive the world, as we saw in the moving dot studies. Hippocampus may be involved in generating these expectations. And in future, a lot more work is needed on this second, more complicated post-stimulus phase, where our perception is really being calculated. And in some future work that I plan to do, we want to try to induce really strong expectations and then only present people with noise, visual noise, and try to induce hallucinations of the expected stimuli, as have been done in a couple studies before. And in that way, try to disentangle both in the neural signals, which things are driven by the input to the eyes and which things are driven by expectations, and how does the combination of those result in subjective perception. I want to thank all the people involved in all this work, especially the people at the Donders Institute and in Floris Lange's group, and in Nick Turk-Brown's lab in Princeton and Yale, and the people who have been working with me on these studies at UCL. And last but not least, the imaging support team at the center, which is really stellar. And thanks to the funders, and thanks to you for your attention.
Thank you, Peter. Fabulous work. Okay, let's see what our time is like. You two have 1 minute left for questions. So I'm going to ask one question that I think you might be able to discuss in 1 minute. This person asked, why are you assuming V1 is the first relevant area when LGN is in the pathway?
Yes, that's a very good question. We have been, I guess, biased towards V1. So V1, of course, is the first cortical stage of processing this kind of information, but not the first neural stage. Of course, LGN also shows some top-down effects of things like attention. And it would be very interesting to look into LGN as well. Part of the reason for looking at V1 is also practical. It's a very large area which you can map very nicely, and it allows you to look at these kind of representations in a good way because you have a lot of signal there. The LGN is, of course, more challenging to study, but that doesn't mean it's not worthwhile. It does seem that there are certain computations occurring in cortex that don't happen yet at LGN. There isn't as much invariance, etc., going on there. But it would definitely really be interesting to see how far back these effects extend. I agree.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Okay, now time for the last speaker in this session, Lucia Melloni. Lucia, can you start sharing your screen?
Yep. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, I think so.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right.
Yes, and I can hear you too.
Is that all okay? Great. So first of all, thank Jay and Mary and Stuart, for inviting me to speak here. When they invited all of us, we're supposed to be not where we are currently, but somewhere else, enjoying a real conference and not a virtual conference. But this has been an interesting year, and I hope that nonetheless you will be able to enjoy, even though we are not physically present. My talk today is where Peter left off his, which is what about subjectivity? And so a lot of our work, partly because I am very puzzled by consciousness, has to link predictions to consciousness. And this started from a simple observation that probably all of us and I will install, in fact, in your mind at the moment, which is like if I show you this black set of dots, and if I ask you what you see, you're going to see something very different now that I show you this dog, and now. And the set of black and white dots hasn't changed on the screen. It's exactly the same. But by showing you the real image, what I've done is install a prior, some kind of like previous experience in your brain, and that has changed the way in which you perceive this. So it becomes fairly clear why we see differently. Right? I don't have to convince you that the predictions do something. So it's very clear that predictions in some ways makes us to hallucinate, as Peter called it, right? And this is interesting, but the trouble is that this is not the only way in which predictions affect the way in which we perceive. There is some other ways in which it does, which is this other one. So imagine that I asked you to look at this digital clock, and then I asked you to tell me whether the tilt of the lower panel is the same or different from the tilt in the upper panel. Most of you will say, you know what, the lower tilt seems very different from the upper tilt, but actually it's exactly the same. The only difference between these two is that we have a ton of experience with digital clocks, and that has made us to discard that tilt. And here we actually see the puzzling aspect. On the one hand, we have predictions that we can install in our mind very quickly, and that change our perception very, very quickly, though systematically and probably for a long-lasting moment, like in the short ones. If I show the image again, you're going to still see the dog, so you cannot really go back to see the black and white dots. In the case of the long-term priors that I'm showing you on the right panel, that has something to do with like a long life history with these digital clocks that has affected us, made us to perceive something differently. And many years when I was very puzzled by these two phenomena, and because it was clear that somehow predictions were playing a role. And at that time, predictive coding started to become very interesting or very well known. And I'm not going to dwell into the is because I think that Peter has already given you a beautiful explanation, as well as Mark. But in short, the only thing that the biggest contribution of predictive coding is it somehow like it turns the mind around. So now everything comes from the top to the bottom. We don't see just because light hits our eyes. We see because we have priors that flow down the hierarchy. And that's actually what makes us in some way to see. And this is a hierarchical process. So it's a very worked out theory. Peter is working out the physical substrate of that. But one of the things that back in the day wasn't clear, really in relationship to predictive processing, was what is the relationship with consciousness? And in particular, as I showed you before, not all the predictions are equal. Some makes us see more or see the same, and some makes us see something different. And really raises the question, why? What is the difference in the mechanism? Secondly, if really we believe that the brain works as the predictive processing machine dictates, this offers us an interesting opportunity to look at what we call perceptual phenotypes. So we're all different. And could it be that we can capture that difference by looking at the history of our experience and the history of our priors? So whatever we have done in the past is what makes us who we are now and makes us to perceive what we are at this point. So you can use predictive processing to try to understand every one of us and our perceptual experiences. But even more interestingly, this is what Mark was trying to present in his talk as well. Predictive processing doesn't end with vision. You know, we tend to do a lot of vision, and this is interesting, but the predictive processing account actually goes also from action. There's active inference. It changes the way in which we fetch information from the environment. We're just not sitting waiting for the information to hit our eyes. No, we move our eyes to fetch the information that meets our priors. So there's a very important perception action cycle that is a part of predictive processing. And I'm going to try to show you some examples as to why it's, we need to probably put more work on trying to understand that part. So as I showed you before, it's here that predictions can stabilize our perception. So I'm going to show you another example, black and white dots. I show you now the frog. Hopefully you can see it. But then if I go back to the black and white, now you see the frog. It wasn't there before. Now voila, it's there. So that's the effect of priors on consciousness. And and we don't need to be like really clever psychophysicists to convince us that this just happens. And this is right, the beauty about studying consciousness. It's just there, it's undeniable. Now, this is not the only way in which predictions change our perception. As I showed you before, there is this other way, which is it makes us, this has this repulsive effect. What I'm going to ask you now, let me put my cursor. Can I? Let me see where I can here. I'm going to ask you to please fixate on this dot here. You see it? And then these lines are going to start moving, right? And then as they move, what I'm going to ask you is to see what happens when the lines stop moving. And then please say for yourself in which direction the lines are, from the top and the bottom. So if this works over the internet, what happens is that the upper panel has a different orientation from the lower panel. And this is just because of what I showed you before. This immediately tells you that, okay, priors to a certain degree are weird. It makes us to see the frog that wasn't there, and then it makes us to see something different than what we would have expected. How come? There's something odd here. And this is what we set out to try to understand. And the idea that we were entertaining is that possibly the reason why there is these two forms of priors is because the brain and us, we are faced with two problems. The visual system needs to, on the one hand, stabilize perception and exploit what's always happening there, but also we need to explore. If we were to always be believing and just imagining what our priors are, we would be losing what is actually out there. So maybe adaptation, what it does is that it actually makes us to tune to things that otherwise we wouldn't see. And this is the same idea of foraging. If you keep eating in the same place, well, what's going to happen? Something very simple. You're going to run out of food and you're going to die. So you better swap between different places because you need to explore other sources. Maybe the visual system does the same. Get stuck to priors, but what if they are wrong? Well, it fetches new one. So that was the idea back in the day, but as Peter was pointing out, we have all of these beautiful ideas, but then we present to our participants very boring stimuli. More or less the same thing that Peter was doing. We presented, instead of grading, these are dot lattices. But in essence, they're just different sort of gratings. Why did we choose gratings? Is because we wanted to look at the so-called bistable stimuli. What is a bistable stimuli? These are stimuli that sometimes are perceived in one way and sometimes they are perceived in another way, kind of like perception cannot decide. And what is nice is that because perception cannot decide, now we can look at the effect of the priors. Because the idea in this case would be that if I have a very strong prior, I will stabilize my perception in some way, right? And we used a typical trick that we know from psychophysics that if the dots are very close to one another, this is so-called binding by proximity, meaning that you're going to see the orientation in this way, right? Now, if you have these two in proximity, now you're going to see the orientation in that way, right? If I show you both, you get confused. Sometimes you see one, sometimes you see the other. But here we are just biasing perception. What that means is that our subjects could either see gratings oriented in this direction or gratings oriented in that direction, depending on the information that we gave them, right? This was the first stimulus that we presented, and we asked them, like, can you please tell us which orientation did you see? And they would give us a response. And then we presented a second one. This gradient is actually very interesting because it's always the same. We never change it. Why did we do that? Because what we wanted to look at is what is the effect of perceiving something in the first stimulus onto perceiving something on the second stimulus, right? And the way in which you measure the so-called like hysteresis or stabilization is by sorting the trials in which you have, for instance, one perception, this orientation, and then you look for the ones before where there was the same orientation. So in a way, you're seeing twice the same. That's the so-called like stabilizing effect, right? But you can also look at where you, again, perceive the same in the second stimulus, but in the first one, you perceive exactly the opposite orientation. And this is what remember the gratings that I showed you? That's the so-called like adaptation, which is exactly that it moves you away from what you would have expected. Now, why did we went through this very complicated paradigm is because it has very nice psychophysical properties. We have access to the responses in the first stimulus. Now I'm sorting the responses of the subjects based on how much information we gave them. So in this presented, we show gratings that were very, very much went to the zero orientation, let's just say left. And most of the subjects says, oh, I see left. When we present the stimuli that has more orientation to the right, most of the subjects say, okay, I see right. So in essence shows us that our manipulation of the parametric manipulation of information really lawfully switches perception. Now, the important aspect is, as I told you, what's going to happen with perception on the second one, that it was always the same, we never change, right? What's going to happen there? Well, now what you see here is that despite being exactly the same stimulus, subjects, if they had seen a lot of, say, zero orientation left, in the second one, they have much more likelihood to see right. And this is the so-called adaptation phenomenon. As you see, one goes up, the other one goes down, right? And now the hysteresis phenomenon, which is seen twice the same, can be perceived, it can in this case be evaluated by looking at how much, if we sort, for instance, our trials based on twice seeing the same versus changing, this is what gives you the degree of stabilization. So now what is nice about this paradigm is that you have in one way, in one experimental setup, access to the two sort of priors. And this is handy because now we run fMRI, we run electrophysiology, computational modeling to try and understand which areas have this different phenomenon and where could this perceptual phenomenon arise. And the first thing we looked was, we did fMRI. This is what Peter showed you before. We weren't that fancy. So he runs at 70, we run only at 3T. So we don't have layer specificity here, but we have access to the whole brain. And this is what we were looking at, because at the time, we actually had zero hypotheses. We didn't know where this was going to happen, you know? So we found out that these are the areas that are engaged into seeing twice the same, the so-called stabilization. As you can see here, these are frontal areas, these are parietal areas, these are higher order visual areas. And what we observed in terms of the responses in the fMRI is that if you see twice the same, the responses are lower in amplitude, and if you see different things, even though remember that it's the same stimulus. This is the effect of the priors, right? So it's not the effect of the stimulus. And this is very consistent with the idea of predictive processing, right? So if you can predict, you have lower responses. If you cannot predict, which means that you switch perception, the responses are actually higher. Now, one very interesting serendipitous finding was this area, the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. This area was the only area from all of the ones that we have found that correlated, whose activity correlated with performance. This means that the higher the activity in this area, the more the subjects were going to see twice the same stimulus. So this is, it relates to behavior, right? And it was the only one. So we looked at, like all of the others and nothing actually happened. So what we decided to do later on was try and investigate this area because we didn't know why that area was so important. So we took advantage of, when you have epilepsy and you have incurable epilepsy, meaning that, there is no pharmacology that can help you, people have to go surgery. And during that procedure, there's electrodes implanted in their brain. And this is the only access that we have to the human brain from invasive, meaning that, we know what those neurons are doing. fMRI is non-invasive, EMG is non-invasive. This is a technique where we can really look into the brain. And what I'm showing you here, these are electrodes that were implanted into 6 patients. And we looked at this area, the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, as well as the lateral areas to try and understand, is there certain specificity in the responses? And we ran exactly the same paradigms I showed you before. So we ask, in this case, patients to report the orientation of the first stimulus, report the orientation of the second stimulus, and we sorted the trials on the second, where the perception was stabilized, based on seeing twice the same versus changing their perception. And what we observed is that this area, much like what we had observed in the fMRI, had a very strong response when the subjects perceived twice the same stimulus. So this is a nice confirmation, and it's an independent confirmation, right? Now, what happened to the lateral area? Well, there's actually a regional specificity, because if we look into lateral areas, this response is not there. This I'm showing you significance. It means that, like, it's only in the medial prefrontal cortex and not in the lateral part. Even more so, you could ask, well, but what about, maybe it's not that the subjects really perceived the thing twice, but remember that I told you that the subjects had to give us a response here. So maybe it could be that it was because they decided that they were reporting that this is what biased their perception. It's not really what they saw before. Well, we thought, well, a very easy way to discard that possibility is to present them a stimulus by which they see anything, but we asked nonetheless to make a response. And we ask, okay, if it is a response, then we should see in these 2 conditions where they see something and they have to respond, where they see nothing and they have to respond, the same responses I showed you in the previous panel, where we didn't see anything. What that tells us is that we're really looking at perception. This is not a decision bias. This is not because I committed to a response that I see this phenomenon. And next, and this was a serendipitous, again, moment, when I was working at NYU back in the day, we came across one patient. She had a previous resection. And this area that I showed you before that was very important for stabilization was resected in her. This means that it wasn't a stroke, it was just removed, with a scalpel. And then we thought, wow, now we can test whether this area is causally involved, because now we have a prediction. She should not have this stabilizing phenomena, right? And that's exactly what we observed. So this is the behavioral responses. So this is perceiving twice the same or changing perception in the case of the patient that has a lesion. And this is in the case of subjects that do not have a lesion. You see a beautiful difference, right? In her case, there is nothing. And it's not, you could say, well, but people are different. If we look at every patient that we tested before, even if they have smaller responses for the hysteresis, even the smallest one was actually far larger than hers. So it seems that this area is really causally involved, right? So far, so good. But remember that so what this tells us is that, okay, it seems that this area plays an important role. We still don't know why. We just know that it does, right? But I think that this is a starting point. But then remember that I told you there is not only one sort of biases in our mind. There is also the so-called adaptation, which means that if I give you a lot of information for one thing, your perception is going to be biased the other way, right? And in the brain, what people think is that the more you put energy on some neurons, the more they fatigue, and because they fatigue, so to speak, they make you to see the opposite. And this is so-called repetition suppression or adaptation in neuronal terms, not in behavioral terms. So we look in the brain for areas that, I want to skip this because it's not that important. We thought, okay, we're going to look in the brain for areas that would have these patterns of responses. So the more information we gave for one, the less activity they show for stimulus. In essence, it's the same patterns of the behavioral responses. And what we observed is that there was only one tiny piece in between B2 and B3 that had this response. Contrary to what I showed you before, remember that there are a lot of areas light up for stabilizing the percept. Only this area light up for switching the percept. And it seems that it's actually really independent. These 2 phenomena are independent, because whenever we looked at in that area whether we observe hysteresis or stabilization, we didn't, and the other way around. So if we look at this area, do we observe hysteresis? It doesn't. So it seems that as if the brain really keeps these 2 modes of perception in separate areas. Now you would be puzzled and you would ask, okay, but how come? Well, and then we actually turn into modeling, right? Why? Because in modeling, and in particular in the Bayesian framework, perception is explained by two terms. On the one hand, the so-called priors, which is like our history of knowledge. You can think of, like the memories that Peter was talking about, or anything that, we had in our entire history. And also with the so-called like sensory evidence, which is what is the information that comes from the eyes. And in the Bayesian framework, what we see, which is the so-called posterior, is a mixture between the prior, which is this distribution, and this distribution, which is the sensory evidence, right? And now the idea here was that, well, maybe actually it's very simple to explain these two phenomena, because probably what hysteresis does is that it changes the prior. In this case, by how much we emphasize what is going to happen. Whereas adaptation maybe changes the so-called like likelihood, which is how does the brain respond to a particular set of stimulus, right? And if you actually look at priors versus likelihood, and you put the adaptation in the hysteresis in the prior and the adaptation in the likelihood, you can actually model perception very easily in these two phenomena. It's just that they have to map onto two different terms, right? I know it can be a little bit technical, but just in simple, what I want to say is that the Bayesian formula, because it has two terms, allows us to put one into hysteresis or the prior into one part, and the an adaptation with a stronger aspect into the other part of the formula. And we can discuss later if you have questions. Now, okay, so this gives a little bit of a story as to why or how we can perceive these two things differently. But now remember that I told you one thing that I find very intriguing is that we not all see the same way, right? So there's people going around that have a condition. It's not a it's not a disease. It's just a condition. They are different, which is so-called synesthesia. What that means is that they perceive the letters or the numbers in colors. This is called a color grapheme synesthesia. So if I show them a 2 in black, they will see, for instance, green, a 2 in green. What is very interesting is that this is systematic for that particular person. So like, let's say I see an A in red, maybe Peter see the A in blue. So we both see it in different colors. What is important is that we perceive it systematically in our own color. That it's not chaos. No, I see my A always red, right? And this is, it's weird, right? But we still need to explain why and how that these people are hallucinating, so to speak, this color, right? Now there is also people that have schizophrenia. People that have schizophrenia, they tend to perceive things as if they actually are less subjected to it, right? So this is I don't know, I mean, I hope that you perceive the typical illusion that everyone else perceived, that whereby this dot seems smaller than this dot. Well, actually, they are the same size. Round that makes them to appear differently. Now, people that have schizophrenia, when you confront them with these stimuli, they see more like as real things. They actually will tell you, what, these two dots are of the same size, as if they are less subjected to these priors, right, to these contextual effects. So then we thought, can we probably have an experimental manipulation by which we can capture these two populations? And many years ago, I had worked on one particular paradigm in which what we did is we put noise, and then we systematically unravel letters. So as you can see here, there's a little bit of an A, a little bit more of an A, and here the A is very clear. And we ask subjects all the time, tell me, like, do you see something, yes or no? Do you see something, yes or no, and so on. And then at the moment at which they saw the A, we started making them less visible. Now, this is the same condition as the frog that I showed you before, right? Because now you know what to expect, and now you know what to see. So there's going to be an A. Psychophysical is that subjects here see much more of an A than what they see here, even though it's the same stimulus. And the only difference is because now they had seen the A in the middle. So they know what to expect. We played the following trick. We embedded the letters in the synesthete colors. So for each synesthete that we invited to our study, we asked them to tell us pick their particular color. So in this case, for instance, for this synesthete, the A would be blue, and therefore we would do it this way. But you can also turn a synesthete into a non-synesthete by presenting them symbols, because they don't have colors associated with symbols, or at least this population that we selected did not. So in essence, they would be synesthete only for this condition, but for this one, it would be like any one of us. They wouldn't see the letters in their specific color. And what you're seeing here is the so-called like psychometric functions. This means like how much somebody sees as a function of the information presented on the screen. And people, are in the red curve. This means that, you and I, would be more or less here. Now, people that have synesthesia, they see much more than us, as you see by this moving upwards. And people that have schizophrenia see much less than us, which is what you see when by the curve moving downwards. Now, as I told you, if we present symbols to the synesthetes, they should be like us, which is exactly what you see here, right? So they only have this advantage when we present them these particular letters. So we can really characterize them now, right? And the schizophrenics, they still have the disadvantage, so to speak. Now, as I told you before, we run what is interesting about this paradigm is that these were so-called like priors or experience that the participants brought to the laboratory. They just came differently. They were made up, by whatever history they had in their life differently. But by me presenting them the A, I can see by how much they can profit from this prior that I can very quickly introduce in the lab, right? And the question for us was like, well, could I make a schizophrenic more like a normal by giving them these priors? Can I restore that? Well, the sad news is that no and yes. What that means is that the schizophrenics, as much as the controls, as much as the synesthetes, they all profit from this prior. So then this means that they all see more, right? But they all see more similarly. What that means is that what we would have wanted is that these curves would have been much higher, meaning that the schizophrenics we could have restored their perception. Well, we could help them a little bit, but since they started with a worse baseline, we just couldn't help them more. So, but at least we could see something. Yeah.
Lucia, 4 minutes left.
Yeah. All right. All right. So now, as I told you, so what is nice about this is that on the one hand, I'll show you that we can somehow characterize people, but I told you that there is another story, which is what happens with actions and with the body. And one of the things that is very clear is that, for instance, if I ask you to look at this image, and I ask you to tell me that, for instance, in this case, oh, are you seeing here, please tell me the ages of these characters, or please tell me the socioeconomical status, or just look around. What the patterns of your eye movements, how you move your eyes, will be very different because you're seeking information in a different way. So in your case, if you're looking for ages, you're going to look at the faces of the characters. If you're looking for socioeconomical status, probably you will look for things like coins and like is there some jewelry around and so on and so forth. Now we play the same paradigm as I showed you before with the lattices. Now we hide images, but now we know where those images are in this stimuli. And instead of now asking the subjects to have their eyes still, we look at can we predict where they were going to look, because now they know what to look for, right? So in this case, we're presenting them it's the same. It's a flavor of the same paradigm as I showed you before. So in this case, we're showing here is almost random, which is like here, and here you see a very nice frog. Right? And we start unraveling the information, and each of these dots is the patterns of eye movement. And now once you have seen it, we start making it less visible. And as you can see eye by eye, is that if you don't know what to look, if you don't know what is on the image, you look, like frantically around. But if you know what to expect, then you just look very much where the stimulus is going to appear, right? And you can quantify that by, how much the so-called like fixation spread, by how much the eyes kind of like move frantically. But you can also do something even more interesting, which is like now we know, because we created these images by computer algorithms, where the information is in these images. And what is very interesting is that now the subjects don't look anywhere. They just look in the places that would allow them to disentangle what images they are seeing. In this case, a cannon or a rocket, for instance. But so now what this means is that these priors also makes us more efficient because we sample the world in ways in which we can extract more information. And now, do I have 1 more minute? Yeah, okay. This is a very short part. I want to tell you something because it's exciting, like a weird thing. So what happens is, if I asked you to, for instance, tell me like how big your hand is, what actually happens is that you feel that your hand has shorter fingers and is wider in the palm. That's how it feels from your internal model. And this is something that is replicated across many different subjects. This is the, you can ask here subjects to point to different points. And this is the hand as perceived, as you see, is much shorter and much wider than the real hand, which is the black one. And that happens regardless of where is your dominant hand or your non-dominant hand. So it's nothing to do with whether you write or not. So you've perceived your body as being shorter and wider. So we thought, well, if I have these priors, would I not change the way in which I interact with the object? Will I not perceive my cell phone as being also smaller, right? Because in principle, can you see it here? Because my cell phone, I use my cell phone all the time with my hand, right? So maybe the way in which I perceive the cell phone relates to the way in which I perceive my hand, right? So Valeria, a very talented PhD student at the time, she asked subjects to tell us how they perceive their hands, mobile phones, an unfamiliar mobile phone, a fake hand, a mag, a cactus, and a disgusting soap. So things that we will interact with versus things that we wouldn't interact with, like as a cactus or a disgusting soap. And in short, what is very interesting, what she observed is that the way in which we distort our hand is the same way by which we distort our mobile phone. And it's the same way by which we distort the mags and the computer mouse that we touch all the time. But not this fake hand, because we don't really want to embody it, nor a cactus that we don't want to touch, nor a disgusting soap, not a disgusting soap that we don't want to touch. So what that in essence says is that, I wanted to skip this so then we can have more time for discussion, is that we distort the world relates to the way in which we perceive our bodies as well. Things that are, that we interact with a lot, we will distort them visually as well. And just to conclude, I really want to tell you that, the way in which we see is the way in which we believe. Most likely you think that these two gentlemen are different. They aren't. It's just the hairline that makes them to perceive, that for you to imagine that they are different. So yeah, and I wanted just to conclude this. Is practical theory of consciousness? No, in its present form, but it's useful to understand consciousness, as I hope that I was able to convince you. And with that, I would just want to thank the people that did the work, Casper, Valeria, Raul, and Tessa, and you for your attention. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Lucia. Okay, panelists. Lucia, I'm going to ask you one question because one of them is staring right at me on the screen. And the question is, how does the predictive feedback from long-term memory differ from predictive feedback from short-term memory, if at all?
This is an excellent question. So this is actually how we started this quest, and so Peter has very good evidence for the hippocampus to play a role in, so let's put it this way. This is our hypothesis, what I'm going to say now. So they have, hardcore data for this. But our hypothesis is that the hippocampus and the cortex with very short-term plasticity can imbue these predictions that are short-term priors. But probably for the ones that you have long-term priors, you need something like heavy plasticity. What that means is that, if you pair two things all the time, then the neurons get paired. And that's how you then can put in the connectivity in your brain, those priors. So it moves from, something that is at the moment versus really literally being in the way in which your B1, as like Peter was showing it, your B2 is wired up. That's what we think.
Peter, would you like to speak to that?
Sure, yeah, I think that was, I totally agree with that. I think the hippocampus, the reason that we find hippocampus for those type of expectations is that they're arbitrary relationships between two stimuli that people have just been exposed to for a few minutes. If you were exposed to these regularities all your life, for instance, other auditory visual relationship like speech, you can predict what someone is going to say partially by looking at their lips. That kind of prediction is much more likely to be much more hardwired in cortex and probably doesn't involve hippocampus. And then even more low-level hardwired predictions like vertical and horizontal lines occur more often in your environment than diagonal lines because of horizons and trees and buildings, etc. That's more likely to be even hardwired in a more simple manner by just having more neurons dedicated to those orientations. So yes, I think the time scale of these expectations makes a big difference in how they're implemented.
Thanks. Great. Okay, I'm going to take a question to Mark from the questions that have been submitted over the course of your talks. Is there a way to enhance meditation by connecting to higher levels of consciousness to have a less subjective and more targeted experience?
Not really sure what that means, actually. I'm not sure how to think about higher levels of consciousness here. And I'm not sure what targeted means there either. So I'm not sure I can answer that, actually.
And I can't unpack it for you anymore either. How about the question you got before about the near-death out-of-body experience? Would that be an example of extreme depersonalization? Have you had a chance to think about that?
Thomas Metzinger does do a lot of work on out-of-body experiences, and some of his more recent work is using the predictive framework. So that would be the place to look if you wanted to find somebody who was talking about it. I don't necessarily, I mean, there are probably lots of things that can happen to create dissociative experiences. And we were really interested in zooming in on one particular thing that can cause a dissociative experience, and that is losing some aspect of the affective tuning system produces dissociative type experiences. But I suspect there's lots of ways in to that dissociative room. And I mean, right off the top of my head, I suspect they're probably different. They're probably very different. George, anything you know about, because George has done work on psychedelics and such, anything about out-of-body experiences?
No, not anything that immediately comes to mind. I mean, no, I don't think so. Yeah, I mean, Thomas Metzinger's got quite a bit on that. He's got a paper from 2009, I think, with yeah, I don't think I've got anything to add to that. We were thinking quite a bit about torture as one example, where if your effective system, it kind of functions to tune you to action possibilities in the environment in a situation where you really can't escape kind of adversive outcomes, that might be a situation where the system learns, oh, like, this tuning mechanism isn't working, and that which would result in depersonalization. I'd imagine something like near death you could think of it in a similar way, or you could think of it through a kind of trauma lens, but
yeah, just sort of building on that, we were thinking also, I mean, given the computational framework, it makes sense why sometimes we can have depersonalization type experiences after tripping on hallucinogens, because if you have a sort of bad experience on a hallucinogen, that's very much like being out of control for what happens next, right? Things are just occurring and you aren't able to get any sort of predictive purchase on them. But I'm not sure how that fits with out-of-body experiences, unfortunately.
Okay, here's another question for Lucia. Lucia, the work that you have presented, this questionnaire states, seems to work for repeated predictable stimuli, but aren't there mainly unpredictable stimuli in the natural environment? So would what you've shown us apply to random, unpredictable natural events?
Yeah, so this is an excellent question. You can think of the following. So in our life, we still have some priors because of the experience that we have had. So even if things are random, they might not appear random to us because they would have a history of, what Peter was telling you now, right? Like the cardinal versus the horizontal orientations. Our brain, because we are much more exposed to that, tend to see those more. So even if I show you something random, you will default probably to those orientations much more than others. So in that sense, they might always affect us. Now, whether or not, the reason why we thought of this idea as exploration versus exploitation is because exactly you don't want to be trapped on your priors, right? So you also want to somehow have a mechanism by which you would explore new things. So even if you don't repeat, you may have the idea that, or you may actually try to anyway use the system to explore new possibilities, to more fine tune. So that's why we think that it's also important to have these other forms of, priors, if you want to call it, that will allow you to move away from just being locked to your hallucinations, which is what the other priors do, right? And it doesn't necessarily apply to all just repeated stimuli. It can just be a train. I think that Flores de Lange, and others have shown that you can have trains of stimuli very much far in the past, and they still can affect your perception. So it doesn't even have to be like one after the other.
Okay, another question I have here from the audience for Peter. It's sort of framing what you talked about as assimilation and accommodation. So let me read the question. One way of looking at this is that we have expected patterns encoded neurally, and the brain preferentially assimilates perception to these patterns, since accommodation requires the energetic effect of changing the entire brain. Can you comment?
I'm not sure I'll be able to very intelligently. I'm not sure what if I understand the question, especially the latter part. I don't know if you're able to unpack it, Mary?
No, the only way I would unpack it, since it's not mine, is explaining this as a change in the use of energy. So the brain is always trying to use as little energy, let's say, as possible. So accommodation requires the energetic effort of changing the entire pattern, whereas assimilation, seeing what you predict, requires less energy. I'm not sure exactly what the questioner was referring to in your data.
Yeah, so I think that is one attractive aspect of predictive coding, that the idea is that if you only need to communicate through neuronal spikes unexpected informations, prediction errors, then that's metabolically in terms of energy much more efficient. If you don't need to fire neuronal spikes, which are quite costly, to every single input you get, but only to the ones that don't match your predictions, that saves a lot of energy. And because you do this, you don't dampen every input, but only the ones that match your expectations. You're still very sensitive to things that don't match your expectations, which is very important in terms of survival. You need to still be able to respond very quickly and strongly to an unexpected threat, for instance. So that is, I think, one attractive aspect of the predictive coding framework. I also want to very briefly comment on the question that Lucia got earlier. The question posed that or suggested that that most inputs are random in the world, but I think from the point of view from the cortex, from the visual cortex, there's a lot more structure in it than you might initially realize. I mean, a lot of the input into your retina changes every time you move your eyes, but not in a random way. You know where you're going to look next and what kind of inputs to expect, for instance. And also, even if you were to look at this at your screen now or at the room around you, it's very likely that 10 seconds from now, most things will be the same as they are now. So there's a lot of structure, especially on short time scales, in the kinds of inputs we get, and that's what a mechanism like predictive coding is really good at exploiting.
Thank you. So I want to ask Lucia to speak a little bit to a similar question, and that is, was it surprising to you that you found such a small area of the brain that was primarily activated when you observed adaptation? And these were visual stimuli, of course, but that it was in such low levels of the visual cortex, as opposed to seeing the priors in VM PFC?
Sorry, I was muted. It's an excellent question. We had, contrary to like which specific area we were going to find, we did have predictions in terms of receptive field sizes. So what is known from psychophysics is that you can move the stimuli, for a fair amount, and you still have hysteresis. What that means is that you have to have areas in the cortex that are higher up. For adaptation, it's the opposite. You move the stimuli and then these effects actually go away. So what that already tells you is that it's much more likely to be a lower area. So in that sense, we knew that it was going to be a lower area as compared to the hysteresis. Now, would it have to be B2, B3? No. Does it fit with the stimuli that actually we are using? Yes, because it's orientation, because it's binding by proximity. So it fits with the kind of stimuli that we used, right? And it also fits the fact that the hysteresis was in LO and not in B2, B3. So that's the way in which we think about it also. And yet an important aspect is this adaptation effect can also happen with stimuli that are unconscious. So that also tells you that if you adhere to the idea that, you know, like in the brain, consciousness is in higher areas, then it's yet another, you know, way in which you can look at, you know, the results.
Interesting. So just pursuing the DMPFC again, schemas seem to be represented in the DMPFC, and a lot of work on the hippocampus and in the field of memory suggests that schemas are represented in the DMPFC. So do you think about priors and schemas as being very similar?
That's an excellent question. And in fact, all of the research that we're doing these days is exactly to chase schemas. So I'm glad you asked that. You know, so we're looking now at, you know, we have a very fun experiment being run by again, like a brilliant PhD student. She's looking at comics. Why? Because in comics, you know, you can have this, you know, you can create these schemas. So for instance, if I show you Snoopy throwing, Charlie Brown throwing a ball to Snoopy, you know, then you actually have the idea that, okay, Snoopy should come, you know, with the ball and so on and so forth, but you can also break it and then you laugh, right? So right. In real life, the contrary to, you know, like I'm sick and tired of, you know, my lines. So I thought, okay, how can I go away from my lines? You know, and I thought, okay, if I go look at comics, I have the schema, I have the break of the expectation. And now we're literally chasing the connection between the DMPFC, the hippocampus, and, you know, like the more abstract prediction. So I'll hopefully, you know, I'll tell you something more intelligent when we have the full data set in a year.
That's fabulous. So Van Kesteren is doing work also looking at the relationship between hippocampus and DMPFC. And yeah. Peter, has the notion of the DMPFC come up for you at all?
It hasn't, but I have to say that my scanning has been biased away from that, I guess. So as Lucia was pointing out, she had some fMRI work where she scanned the whole brain. So that's a very unbiased and nice exploratory way of looking at the whole brain. Whereas we've really been trying to zoom in on, for instance, hippocampal subfields, cortical layers, and those come at the cost, that high resolution comes at the cost of not being able to scan the whole brain. So we've been mostly like zooming in on a specific part. So that's one reason I think we've been kind of, we've not been seeing anything in those kind of regions. And maybe DMPFC, this doesn't apply to the most, but some of those frontal areas suffer a lot from distortions. Probably DMPFC is probably not the worst, but that's another reason perhaps for not being as easy to find things in areas like DMPFC.
Thanks. Okay, so I'm scanning the questions. I'm looking for one for Mark, another one for
I have one for Mark. Can I
Great,
take a minute?
Yes, please.
What about resilience?
Yeah, well, we're writing a paper right now on resilience.
Good.
Yeah, look at you, exactly, right. Yeah, it's a little bit of a, I mean, it shares some features of this story, but it is a little bit of a pivot. The sort of exciting idea that we're investigating is we do a lot of work on how we succeed at doing individual predictive tasks, like how do you pick up a mug or how do you saccade here or there. But what is still missing is something about the sort of predictive style in which you fulfill these predictive tasks. And so we're thinking about, a lot of this came out of because I've had a sort of, for the last couple of years, quite depressing topics. You know, we looked at depression, anxiety, depersonalization, dissociative disorders. And finally, we're writing a paper on happiness and its relationship to resiliency. And the big thing we're drawing out is that in all of these pathological cases, they're arising from some kind of cognitive rigidity. So the predictive system, the predictions or the priors or the precision estimations are getting frozen in one sort of way of being past their usefulness for whatever reason. So think about the comorbidity between perfectionism and depression. We have a paper out on depression that sort of looks at this as well. Perfectionism, so if you come from a culture or a family dynamic where people are really expecting a lot from you, then that can peg your precision for your own success quite high. And even though you fall under it, rather than the model being updated, which it should do, right? If you do worse than expected, that worse than expected feeling should lower your expectation. And that's a good thing, because then when you do better than expected, then you're getting dopamine there that's teaching you how to do better than expected. But you can get, it looks like we can have precision pegged in some way so that we constantly fail over and over and over again. So when the system learns a sort of learned helplessness, it learns I can't, actually, no matter what I do, I can't seem to reach the predictions that I expect, which becomes a bit vicious. So we've been thinking that if you take that as your starting point, that pathology has a lot to do with rigidity, then what is health? And it looks like it's a polystable state. So we're thinking resilience is going to be a sort of metastable, a metastable style of predicting, where you don't get stuck in any one attractor state for too long. You're able to bump in and out of tasks and styles. So you see a lot of that in mindfulness meditation. Also, learning how to recontextualize a situation is the basis of resiliency, but we're getting the computational bones around it right now.
It's like akin to curiosity. That would be the...
Right, exactly, because you do have sort of an exploit, explore thing happening here, which is, so again, addiction, we wrote a paper on addiction, and addiction is the sort of opposite of that. You get frozen in one style, you stop being curious, so you stop paying attention to the rest of the things that are interesting, you get locked down into one style of being. And resiliency is sort of almost the opposite of that, where you are constantly in touch with your various cares and concerns. You're in touch with your various predictive tasks. So the question is, well, how do we stay connected to all of our predictive tasks? And so we have an affective story there as well, but it's still coming out.
Thank you.
Interesting.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Super good.
So Mark, here's a question from somebody who really wants to be able to read more of your work. What is the title and year of the, quote, full paper you mentioned for more details of your talk?
Right, it's coming out right now. So it will be Dean, Miller, and Wilkinson. This is George Dean here on the call, and it'll be coming out in the new collection. George, what's the collection called at Frontiers? This?
It might be This Self.
This something about self? I can't remember just now.
Disruptions in self-experience or something
right,
like that.
Exactly. It'll be coming out, it's already passed, so it'll just be coming out in the next couple of weeks, I suspect.
Great. Oh, it's, oh no, sorry, that's something else.
Disattending to the self.
Okay, in Frontiers.
Exactly.
Great, thank you. Here's a question for Peter. Peter, is there a connection between predictions generated by the hippocampus and theta precession a la Lissman and Buzzacki?
Yeah, great question. I haven't yet looked at hippocampus with time resolved data to be able to look at these kinds of oscillations in the hippocampus, but it is something that would be very interesting. And I think there are ideas about theta playing a role in predictions, basically also kind of thinking navigational processes in rodents, kind of predicting which path the rodent will take, etc. I think that will be future work that will be interesting. There is work at our center done by Eleanor Maguire using MEG, but a new version of MEG called OPMs, optically pumped magnetometers, which get a better signal from the hippocampus. Because the challenge is for human neuroimaging that the hippocampus is a deep structure. With those kind of data, you would be able to look at the communication between the cortex, visual cortex, and hippocampus in a time-resolved way, which would allow us to see if indeed the phase of theta and hippocampus is coupled to the way predictions are present in visual cortex. I think that'd be really exciting to look at in the coming years.
Yeah.
I don't have a really good hypothesis at the moment, but hopefully more later.
Thank you.
Mary, just quickly, so the collection is called Disembodied Perception of Self and Other in Frontiers of Psychology.
Great.
Yeah, and the paper's called Losing Ourselves.
Great title.
Same title as the talk.
Okay. So I have a question for Peter. Let me see if I can phrase this so that you know what I'm talking about. So in the first paper by Fraser, Aitken et al. That you discussed, we saw evidence of expectations in the deep layers of the cortex, but I was surprised that you didn't see evidence of prediction error in the superficial layers of the cortex when the stimulus did not appear. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, yes, I mean, of course, I don't have a definitive answer to this, but the way I think of it generally, prediction errors are incoming sensory signals that aren't suppressed by a prediction, so that don't match your prediction. So in this case, there is no incoming sensory signal, so there is no real prediction error. Of course, it might still be that there are also neurons that code for unexpected omissions of things. There's some there's a paper by Georg Keller who suggests that there may be separate populations of prediction error units that signal for more than I expected and less than I expected. But that's at the moment, I think, still open for debate. If the neurons just signal whether there's more than you expected, then in these omission paradigms, you wouldn't actually expect prediction error response in superficial layers. But we're starting a study now where we're going to look at stimuli that either violate your expectations or match your expectations, and there I would expect to see an error signal in the superficial layers.
Yeah, that makes sense. Great. Yeah. Okay, Lucia, you noted that predictive coding is not a theory of consciousness. What do you think of Solms and Friston's efforts to make it one?
I think that this is the way in which it should go. So if it is a theory of everything, it should include consciousness, I hope. So that has been my quest. So I'm very pleased to see the efforts. That's why I said like it's a proviso. At the moment, it doesn't, but I'm really hopeful that it will eventually.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Okay, I'm not finding any more questions here coming in from the audience. Do you have questions for each other, panel members?
Can I ask Lucia a quick question?
Absolutely.
I always find synesthesia really fascinating. So it's really cool that you're looking at that. I was wondering, so that, and I especially like it when there's an advantage to synesthesia, so you can really show it does something out of the ordinary. Do you have any speculations or even work looking at the neural mechanisms underlying this? Are you planning to do any scanning with these participants, for instance?
So the Tessa, the person who actually led that effort, she did collect images. She's still analyzing those data, and what we were in particular what we're intrigued by is there is two theories about synesthesia, right? So it's either I don't know if you know about it, but one possibility is that there is a stronger connectivity between the so-called B4, which is the area that codes for color, and a visual one from area in the brain, which are actually very close by. So there could be like crosstalk between them. Or it could be disinhibition from a third area, which is more parietal. So at any rate, it actually gives you a very nice circuitry to play around with, because you know from where the priors should come, right? At the same time, it's difficult because what we speak before, right? In synesthesia, you have priors that are probably embedded in the connectivity. And it's much more difficult probably to really see that. So maybe a technique which would look at the strength of the connections would be better than any of the techniques that we currently really have. So she's looking at that, but I'm not super duper hopeful that she's going to get to the real meat, which would be like looking at the synaptic strengths, which is not.
Yeah, sounds really interesting. I also wonder if there's some benefit to using a time resolved method at some point, like EG or MEG, if you're trying to decide between feedback or lateral connectivity.
Correct. Yeah.
Interesting.
Spot on.
Great discussion. So here's another question that came in from Mark from the audience. This questioner first compliments you on your talk, great talk. Then comes the but. But do you include independent versus interdependent models of self in Western and East Asian cultures, according to cultural psychology research by, for example, Richard Nisbet, Jeannie Tsai, and others?
Yeah, no, No, we haven't thought about it, but I mean, of course, one should think about it because you're right. There's very different views of the self. But I suspect the same hardware story that we have here about affectivity is going to be cross-cultural, but it would be something to look into. What I would suspect would be the case is that the affective machinery is still tuning us, but how it's tuning us could be really culturally different. So what the paper looked at was what happens when that machinery goes mute or gets suppressed in some way. And I would suspect that the cultural differences won't be about that machinery, but how that machinery is used. So I suspect you'd have the same sort of dissociative outcomes if you lost that machinery, regardless of if you were in an independent or an interdependent culture. George, anything you want to add?
No, I don't think so. That's not stuff I'm really familiar with. I guess part of our proposal is that we kind of give an account of the self, very much influenced by other similar active inference accounts of selfhood. Yeah, so that's like kind of part of our argument is providing this account and then saying, oh, this is how this would be altered into these different cases.
And so, I mean, one thing there is we're interested in looking at what the computational profile might be for a sense of self, but that's a very thin definition of self. We weren't working with a very thick view of self. I mean, it doesn't extend as far as thinking about things about yourself or thinking about how you interlock with a community. Not necessarily anyway. We were just looking for the feeling of being you. So again, I think that might be pre-cultural. I think probably that basic wetware is going to be just the same, and then it'll be used in all sorts of, well, in all the diverse ways that we use it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And you know, it would, I think, or at least in my mind, it would apply to organisms simpler than human beings.
Sure it would. Right, yeah. Indeed. Right.
So we're out of time. I want to thank the panel members profusely. Your work is really moving forward the predictive coding framework. Your talks are excellent and your work is exciting. I also want to thank George for his contributions and wish you the best at the rest of this conference. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.